Welcome to Saudi Arabia. The Mental Space podcast has traveled to the kingdom for the Sync Summit, which is all focused on digital well-being. What is the future of humanity and technology? How do we protect our well-being? How do we protect our children? Or indeed, how can we flourish as the world adopts AI and accelerates into our adoption of technology? We're going to be here for the conference 2 days. We're going to be bringing you a whole bunch of speakers in a special episode of the podcast. Luckily enough, we've got our first speaker. This is Nina Hersher from the Digital Wellness Institute. Now, Nina, on the podcast, we always ask our first question, which is, what does mental health mean to you?
Amazing question. So in the context of digital flourishing, mental health means to me that we can really empower people to use technology in a way that fuels them and supports their well-being in all different holistic dimensions.
Okay. Tell me about the work of the Institute and more specifically why you've made the trip, because you've come from the US to here to the Kingdom.
I have, yes. This is my second time presenting at Sync, and the first time I think was less focused on AI. This year is all about harnessing tech and finding that balance. The Digital Wellness Institute was formed essentially to give people a different approach, and so our approach of flourishing is really how can we engage in technology in a way that is mindful, where we can negate some of the unintended consequences from tech neck to FOMO to depression, cyberbullying, so much of what's being talked about today. And so all of our research and our courses are rooted in positive psychology, and I think it is that kind of healthy tech versus anti-tech approach that really draws people in, because there's talking today so much about fear and the research, which is important, but then the action and what do we do afterwards is equally as important, and we want to leave people feeling empowered.
Because it's interesting, we've obviously heard from some very powerful speakers.
We are.
One, mother who lost her child to cyberbullying. It's interesting you use the word flourishing, because we do, and like my generation worry for our children when we see the impact of social media. We've heard about Steve Wozniak from Apple also decrying social media. The fact is that we're not going to be able to put this back in the box. It's only going to keep being more and more part of our lives. So when you focus on flourishing, what are the things you say? What can parents do? What can people do? What can we do to ensure that we flourish while also using technology?
So if you go to digitalflourishing.com, there's a survey instrument that we've worked very hard on that's been published. There's one for adolescents and one for adults, and you can get kind of an overview of how you're doing in all different categories of digital wellness with actionable tips. But to answer your question, I think that each of us can look at our individual action and then how we can be change agents in our homes, in our workplaces, and looking at the intersection of behavior change and also the development of tech. I think a lot of the people here were really focused on enhancing human relationships through the intentional development and kind of usage of tech. But beyond that, I think we're seeing a paradigm shift to digital resilience. And so there's a lot of what I call bridge education work that's being done right now. I'm actually originally trained as a counselor. I create courses that give continuing education credits to clinicians, to psychologists, to nurses, to doctors who maybe have been hearing tangential terms but haven't really learned how exactly does blue light impact sleep health. What is email apnea? Are we actually holding our breath when we're checking our email? What impact is that having on our nervous system?
I think I've been there, email apnea, and that's a new one on me. But I will use that again.
There's so much research out there, and it's as intriguing as it is terrifying. But I think everyone here already is kind of practicing that collective pause to see how can we interact with technology in a way that serves us and not the other way around.
Have we crossed that pivot point where we now know? Because my generation of parents didn't know the impact on their kids when Facebook first came around. Even as Steve Wozniak was saying this morning, it's amazing. There's unintended consequences of technology. We have a generation, Gen Z, who are struggling with anxiety. Every survey around the world keeps coming back to, their mental health struggles. But they're the first generation that grew up in this. Some would call it a sewer, some would call it an overabundance of information. Do we now realize, you think, that our Gen A and the kids that come after we need that balance because it's not all good.
I think we do, and I think that people are equally coming from places of prevention as well as triage, and we're going to keep seeing this. The natives who have grown up with this don't know anything else.
Yeah.
I'm a big proponent of quiet time and introspection. I sometimes worry about the youth who have been kind of born into this noise, and if they don't have any of that quiet time for introspection, for identity development, for self-regulation, to troubleshoot on their own, how are they going to know how they feel? How are they going to know how to problem solve?
Because sometimes we see that they can't be bored. You know, that it's really difficult for them to be bored and just do nothing.
Yeah.
Because entertainment is fed to them 24/7 by the internet. So, last question. You've been very generous with your time. What gives you hope?
It gives me hope to see this conference. I think that digital well-being work can't be done completely online.
Yeah.
I think if we're solving for human connection, if we're solving for well-being, we need to be able to talk to each other, make eye contact, say, oh, how do I feel in my physical body?
Yeah.
Which I've forgotten to check in with because we're online so much that we're overriding our hunger cues, our tech pain cues, and so much more. And so these are things that are most easily discovered and accessed together.
These are funny things that we used to say just affected the gaming community, like 10 years
and
ago.
now it's everyone.
And now it's everyone.
It's everyone. So it gives me hope to be here. We're normalizing the conversation and we're bringing it to a place of action. And I think that's hugely empowering.
Great. Nina, thank you for joining us on the Mental Space
Podcast.
Of course. So now on the podcast, we are joined by Michael Hodgkinson, who is the Middle East lead with PSB Insights. Around the conference, with a whole bunch of statistics that are from the Digital Wellbeing Global Report, which Michael has basically been the driving force behind, which I believe has been delivered here at the conference. Tell me a little bit, if we can start maybe with the top levels then. So, massive piece of research looking into digital wellness trends around the world. Give me the top levels.
Brilliant. Well, 35,000 interviews across 35 countries. I think it is the largest digital wellbeing study in the world. I'm yet to be corrected on that fact, so I'm going to take it as true for the moment. Look, I think the big trend for me was around how things were getting better, and I'd say this in kind of like a somewhat contradictory sense. I think all of us know this is becoming more of a debate. Digital wellbeing is becoming more important. People talk about it more. The mental health implications are becoming better understood. But actually, for a lot of people, when we did our first piece of research 2 years ago, that was the back end of COVID. And I don't think any of us really realized technology was so important in helping us solve COVID or helping us get through COVID.
Yeah.
But the tricky bit is, how do we get out of it, right? So that adaptation back to reality, I think, was quite tricky for a lot of people. And in some respects, stopping using tech in the way that we did during COVID was a challenge. So when we did that first survey, things were quite a lot worse than they are now. I think what's happened since is people are becoming more aware of the issues. So they're becoming more conscious of the things that are affecting them. And that's mean they're starting to take action on this. So we're seeing half of people globally who are saying they're taking some action to reduce their social media usage, whether that be deleting Instagram for a day, or whether that be using some more specialized apps, or even something more drastic. So I think something that really stood out for me was this notion of people taking a bit more control. That being said, I think we've got a long way to go. I think kind of quite clearly people are very concerned about this. And I think the overriding stat, and it's one that we saw firstly 2 years ago, but now people are more likely to believe that tech is addictive. So over 4 in 5 people are saying that globally that tech is addictive, which is strong. 4 in 5 globally. Yeah. So people acknowledge this problem, but I think the challenge we've got to face to is how do we get to a place where people are able to control some of those kind of less good bits, I suppose, of the technology conundrum.
We'll continue to dive into the report, but just around that, it's interesting here around this concept of self-regulation versus regulation, fear, flourishing, who's to blame. Steve Wozniak yesterday was putting the blame squarely at the foot of the tech companies and regretting his part in the conversation. Was there anything that came out of the report that suggests there is an answer either, or is it both?
Yeah.
Those two things. It's all about paradox.
It's a really good question, right? And I think, being here, you get to meet lots of experts in the field who spend time thinking about this.
On both ends of the spectrum.
On both ends of the spectrum, right? And I think, speaking as someone who's seen 35,000 interviews and what a global view might represent, I think people don't know, I think is the short answer. I think it's a situation where people are trying their best, but actually, you know what? People can't disconnect realistically. They can't remove themselves from technology in the way they might like to otherwise. And actually, this is an issue that needs leadership on. We're seeing, and I think this is a really, really important part of the research, is that people are giving almost contradictory responses to things. So, I gave the example earlier, they see things as addictive, but they use loads of tech. They're talking about social media often having bad implications for their lives, but also they're using it more than they ever did in the past. Like, there are all these elements that almost don't quite make sense, and I think this speaks to the complexity of the issue, and why I say this is important is I think the answer is some degree of leadership, right? This needs someone else to come in and say, right, this isn't working. Clearly, we're not able to get the balance right? And I think that's the key point here.
I've not seen self-regulation work very well in many years.
Yeah, exactly.
So, carry on. Sorry.
No. I think this is it, right? I think what I'm always saying to is like the fact that we as a society have so much other stuff going on. We have so many other things, and we're just trying to get by. It very much says the fact that actually, if we want to deal with this issue seriously, it needs serious leadership and potentially legislation to look to do that. I would also say, like, to add, we talk about some legislation that's already been put in place. You see some things coming out of the US, out of Europe, so it is starting to happen. But what's also happening is like people aren't realizing this. So that legislation isn't really cutting through. And so whatever we're doing now, I would say, doesn't feel like enough. And I think putting it back onto people is fine, but I would just feel like people are already trying to do this stuff and they're not quite getting the full picture. So definitely some kind of like broader leadership to try and solve these challenges, I think would be helpful, is coming from the report.
Is it fair to ask people to self-regulate? I'm a parent.
Yeah.
I often have empathy for parents that, are trying their best, but then they're faced with this question around their children's use of social media.
Yeah.
Question whether children should be on social media in the first place. But we talk about algorithms, and I had a fascinating conversation with Professor Andrew Sharpilsky.
Yeah.
Very different.
Andrew's got to give you on these things.
He's got some really fascinating perspective on. But we're talking about algorithms that have, or the documentaries would tell us, have been designed by the same scientific experts that design those addictive algorithms, Las Vegas, and that sort of thing. So are we equipped as, I don't want to use the word ill-educated people, but we're not batting in the same league.
No, and I was, look, it's a really, from a data perspective, it's a very hard question to answer because you're asking me a hypothetical, but I will give you an anecdote as my way around this. And I was doing a focus group in Australia, I think it was Australia, a few months ago, and chatting to a lady there, and she was in her, I would say, late 40s, mid 40s. She admitted to using social media and her phone at least 12 hours a day. She was like, I can't be without it. I go to the toilets and I have to have my phone on me. I have to be looking at things. And I asked her, well, don't you see a problem with this? Are you concerned about your level of usage? And she was like, honestly, I tried to quit my phone, but it was harder than when I tried to quit smoking. And she admitted this, but she said, you know what? I like my phone. I'm happy to keep it. This notion of actually, for most people, they see it as an addiction, and they're trying on some level to fix it. But actually also there's this thing in the back of the head which is saying, actually, you know what? I'm quite enjoying this. This is quite good. So I think, like, to your point, I don't know even if we could. I think that's the actual answer here. I think for large amounts of people, even if some can, I don't even know if we can as a society at this point.
We talk about, millennials, Gen Zs, the kids, and they're always online, this kind of stuff. Like, let's be honest, what is the behavior that we model to? Because it's difficult enough for us as adults to put the damn thing down and actually to stay off the screen.
But I think there's also to that, something that came from the research was this idea of the perception of how different generations view technology. And I think this is also quite an important thing to get to. We talked about AI, but we talked about a few other things as well. And one of the things that really struck me was, firstly, AI, and just using this as an example of a kind of very nascent and new technology, AI is something that is affecting people globally in a pretty uniform way, actually, right? Like, it's something that's gone around. ChatGPT went around the world in very small amount of time, in a way that even when the iPhone was released, that took 15 years or 10 years for smartphones to become ubiquitous in some parts of the world, right? So the notion of AI, it became universal very quickly. And what's really interesting about that is if you ask Gen Z what they talk about when they think about AI, and you try to ask them to summarize it globally, they talk about it in terms of algorithms, about replacing human decision-making, about this idea of choices. And so there's a uniformity to that. And I think what's quite interesting is they're clearly trying to understand what it is, right? They're clearly trying to be like, I need to know what this technology is. I need to be able to work with this technology. So they're really trying to embrace it. You ask millennials like myself about it, and I'm like, the ethics, I'm so worried about the implications of this and what it might mean long term. So I have a whole different perspective. Mine's all about is this the right thing to do, right? But I know that there might be a world where I can get away with it for 20 years and not have to use it too much. So I've got a different attitude. If you're a boomer, you're like, what about jobs? And what about how's this going to implement in this way? How's it going to impact my kids when they come to the workforce? And the very oldest people, those from the boomer generation, the 1960s, that it's just an even larger computer to them. It's another way of computing things. And so I think this notion of how different generations are seeing this is an element that we haven't quite fully understood, but it's really quite a generation important. Right.
Obviously, I'm ready to bow down to our robot.
Yeah.
Question I wanted to ask you when you talked about legislation. What do you think that looks like? Because I think Dr. Andrew was talking about he didn't think the legislation was pointed at the right things.
Yeah.
His argument was that actually we should be getting the data out of the big tech companies to actually see what's happening inside, because we're not seeing the full picture.
Yeah.
Is it possible to legislate sort of outside in?
Yeah.
Or do we need to somehow open up these companies? Where do you see it?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good question. Look, the answer to what I think what a lot of Andrew says, right, is, well, do we need more data? I think there's two ways of looking at it, one of which is a kind of let's try and adapt what we have into something that's healthy, and there is a more drastic element, which is do we look to start to remove certain bits of it from common usage? And I think like most of my work tends to revolve more in the political sphere and the social sphere. And I think the problem is that those adaptations to make it more useful, and to make it more friendly to people's usage in terms of their mental health and other things, that often involves more decisions and choice making going back on the consumer, right? In a way that it never would have been previously. But if you were to say, for example, ban the use of AI in social media, just as an example, or ban the use of algorithms in social media and see what that does, I think that's a much more easily implementable thing on the person, right? We are defaulting to that. And I think that's the other part to this as well. Is there a way to try and default solutions to people where some of the things that we know are more problematic, that have more, for example, addictive tendencies, is there a way for you to be opting into those as opposed to opting out of them, which is kind of what it is at the moment. And I think that's the key for people, right? Like any legislation, any policy recommendation, any changes need to be done in such a way that people don't have to opt in, if you submit. The onus needs to be on the company to be able to get someone's permission rather than the other way around. And I think at the moment it's very much the other way around. We'll be forced into things that we don't know we otherwise have a choice to be able to do. And I think that's the key bit for any future legislation, is to consider that element in particular.
Let's dive back into the report. Give me a more top level if you can. What else stood out? You talked about AI.
Yeah.
What were the findings around AI? Because as you say, it has almost become, it is an overnight sensation, and that's clearly not going anywhere.
Yeah.
It's only get faster, only going to get smarter, only going to get potentially more useful.
Yeah.
But is that also addictive? Are you seeing that?
Well, I mean, remarkably, 70% of people globally said that they would pause the development of AI if they could until greater regulations are in place. It's a number on one of the walls over there. I think that's one of the more remarkable ones for me. Like this, obviously, we know the genie's out of the bottle, and actually, there's no way you can legislate something globally to be able to say we're going to pause AI regulation. But actually, the fact that people are so, concerned, aware of the challenges that AI might face eventually, actually speaks to the fact that this is a challenge for many people, and they are looking for just for a bit of a breath almost. I think we've been through so many technology changes in the last 25 years that actually just to pause for a little while would be great, and more speedy development isn't necessarily a good thing. So I think there's certainly that. I think there's concerns around jobs long term and the impact that AI might have potentially around that. There's concern about the implementation of their day-to-day lives, or where it's being used and how it's being used. But also there's a lot of hope, there's a lot of optimism, right?
I mean, we talk a lot about fear.
Yeah.
And what I do like about this conference as well is we've actually, had a variety of voices. Some who are pro, some who are want to reframe it. Some who are talking about. So we heard Kristen died yesterday, who lost her son to cyberbullying.
Yeah.
So there's a massive range of opinions. But where do you come now? What is your view on AI? Should that sit? Are you with the 71%?
I wish we could. Personally, I wish we could. Yes. No, personally, I wish we could. But why?
Yeah, because I ask you why, because you've been involved in the research.
No, just because I think, to be honest with you, things are perfectly good as they are. I'm not entirely sure what. This is it, and I think this is the challenge actually looking more globally as well. It's what actually is AI? What is the notion of the notion of AI and kind of what it is? I think that people don't fully understand the concept of AI. And I don't mean that. I don't actually think anyone knows what the concept of AI is. I think that's part of the challenge, right? You speak to 10 different experts at this conference.
I think OpenAI is still figuring that one out.
Exactly right. And so when you're at a point where you're talking about something that doesn't have a clear definition yet, actually we have some theoretical use cases, but the real use cases are quite limited to a few different things. And I think, it's some of the more developed machine learning models and similar things that have been around for the last 10 years that actually have been the ones that are generating most of the problems. Now, if AI really does have the power that people say it might have, then obviously that has fundamental problems in terms of the level of addictiveness of these technologies. Like, how might they be in 10 years' time compared to what they are now? So look, on that basis, basically on the concept of what might it be, yes, I'd love to see it paused, but I just know there is also strong benefits to it. And unfortunately, you can't ban it globally.
The positive side. What do you think? Well, what came out of the report that talked about the positive side?
Look,
I like the fact you're saying that people are getting more educated. Is there a generational gap with that, or
definitely, yeah. So it's amazing how it's like a Gen Z thing, and I would really like some of the guys here at Sync. They're doing some work with Gen Alpha, so like 14, 15-year-olds, and also they're like super involved in this stuff. They're really interested and really engaged in it. So I think it's that young generation are really quite excited by it. It's going to fundamentally change their lives, right? I think we can all see that at this point. How it changed their life, I think it's an open question, but it's really going to change their lives. So yeah, look, I think it's a really interesting point. I think for right now, for people, they see it mainly in the concepts of work. So obviously there are some advantages in terms of your ability to socialize with people, but actually that's changed a lot recently anyway. Like, this is mostly about, can they do work more effectively? Can they work less hours? Like those elements as well. But obviously they're not without their side effects too. So while there's a clear benefit in a kind of work and economic space, I think there's also there's a lot of potential side effects to that people are conscious of at the same time. So it's almost like there are all the positives and people are excited by new technology, but there's also a fear of what are the other things that might come alongside that.
So you're clearly cleverer than I am. You've come to this conference. It's not hard. That's not a big. That's not a high bar.
I can't believe that's true.
But you've come to this conference.
Yeah.
Huge piece of research, a series of beliefs, and a series of evidential findings.
Yeah.
What have you heard at this conference, or who have you heard from, that has either challenged, changed, or shaped or reshaped some of your perspectives, before walking through the door?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a topic I've been working on for like 3 or 4 years now, and I think I describe it as a bit of a journey. Actually, I think it's a remarkable how, when I first started working on this 4 years ago, digital wellbeing was like a thing. But I remember having a long session where we tried to work out what digital wellbeing even meant, right? It wasn't a concept then. It was the word digital, the word wellbeing, and they were mushed together in this very vague idea. Like, we've now got to a point where if you open a newspaper now, there's a fair chance within the first 10 pages you'll see some article related to the use of technology and how it's impacting our lives, right? That is a almost universally and daily issue that people are almost dealing with. And so coming to comments like this and seeing the evolution of those debates is so fascinating. I would actually touch on something in particular that we were discussing yesterday with Mo Gaudat, who used to be at Google. And he was very, very honored to be on a panel with him. And he was just focusing on this notion of how it's not the AI's fault, it's our fault. And I think that's also part of things. And I even see that in the way I was discussing the AI points earlier when you asked me about it, right? Like, I was talking about it in this abstract thing, this kind of like, to your point about Terminator, right? This kind of like theoretical big thing that's going to come and get us one day. And actually, he's completely right. Like, it's actually about what we decide to do in these things. So I think trying to put that back on those who are in the space and try to be more robust in that, and potentially not just assume that it's a train coming down the track that's going to come eventually, but actually see it as something we do have a degree of control over, I think is really important, and it's just important to hear that call to action, I think, for
Is that
people.
kind of like Anna started the session yesterday with it talking about it being the knife that you can either use to cut the vegetable or to stab someone?
Yeah, I mean, that's a drastic analogy, but may not be terribly far from the truth. We do indeed, don't we? We do indeed.
2 questions. What's your screen time, social media time, that digital well-being?
Yeah.
How's that working?
Do you want to guess? I'll tell you what. Guess from what I've given you answers.
I'm going to say about 12 hours a day.
I got rid of all my social media about 6 years ago.
So where are you at now?
I mean, I try my very best to do as little as I can. It's mostly work related, and I find it hard to disconnect from the work bit, but I try my best to probably keep to 3 or 4 hours a day kind of thing.
And how has that changed you? How has that changed levels of anxiety, overall contentment? What's been the difference?
I think to start, it was driven very much by trying to not spend dead time doing seemingly meaningless things, I think. And during
The last 15 minutes talking to me.
well, I mean, and it's been all right. I've very much enjoyed this. And I think, like, look, I was trying to get away from that personally and just do things like read more, go outside more, like do some of the things that I think I like to think that I did as a kid that I do less of now. And I think it was good for about 2 years. And then I probably slipped back into just different kinds of habits. So it's interesting how, whereas I previously might have scrolled through Instagram, I now scroll through a news article, a news website or something similar. So while I feel like the quality of the interaction has got better, which I know is an important variable with a lot of these things, I have to be honest, like this notion of a screen being addictive, if you ask my wife, I'm sure she'd agree. Like, even though I'm trying my best not to do the social media and other things, like...
Even though you have all that research,
It doesn't make a difference.
Hard for you.
No, it's hard for all of us.
You're showing your age as well, because I think you're perhaps, because I'm a Gen X, you're a millennial. I'm not sure Gen Z is going to turn around and use phrases like, if I open a newspaper.
Well, indeed, yes.
Because I'm not sure that is, I think I was a print journalist, I started in
Yeah.
when I was 16 years old. I think we've lost something as well.
I agree completely, yeah.
Even if it's being exposed to a diversity of news stories.
Yeah.
Whereas right now, it feels like we're just being fed the one thing.
Yeah. And I think this is, like, again, come back to those focus groups. I think what really came out was this notion of, like, we could all accept our addiction to this. And that's the fact, it's the cognitive dissonance, which I appreciate it's a long phrase, but it's the cognitive dissonance of saying, I'm addicted to this technology, but I want to keep using it. And I think there's very few things in the world that are like that. And I think that makes it quite remarkable.
It's part of the problem when we phrase this debate about the fact that if you talk about smoking, you can see the physical. If you talk about drinking, you can see the physical harm.
Yeah.
If you talk about any of the overeating, that sort
Yeah.
of thing,
Yeah.
you can see what it does
Yeah.
to us. We can't see what it
Yeah.
does to us.
Completely.
It's hard. It's more, we could talk about mental, and we try to tackle the stigma of mental
Yeah.
health. We actually try to tell everybody, look, the statistics tell us that we're all impacted by
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
but we don't see it. It's not as easy to quantify.
I don't think it's easy. I don't think we can quantify it at all. I think that's the challenge, right? Like, and that's actually the problem. Like, in a political sphere, you go around and say, what's your call to action? You know, every time you talk about something, every time you publish something, every time you do something, at the end of it has to have a call to action. What's the call to action here? Like, everyone's very clear on the fact this is a problem. And I think people are like, well, there are certain things we can do. But in the end, without knowing this is an X trillion dollar problem, or without knowing it affects X billion number of people, it's near impossible to get a sense of scale. And without the sense of scale, it's very hard to get people to focus on it. So I think absolutely, like, the problem here is that we can't put a number on it in the end. And we can ask people as much as we want, but in the end, how much damage that does is almost impossible to quantify as things stand. And until that changes, then it's going to be really hard to kind of coalesce everyone around it. And I think while these events are super impressive, it's not going to have the focus that tobacco does, or any of the other kind of like wide social problems that we face. It's not going to have that kind of focus until we are able to try and better understand the actual size of the impact.
Final question. We always ask it on the Mental Space podcast. What does mental health mean to you?
Wow, that's a very interesting question. I think mental health means being able to live your best life. I think full stop, actually.
Okay.
Like, and by that I mean.
Well, I am going to ask you to go further with that, because that
No,
is
no.
a meme from social media.
Oh, is it really?
Yeah, living my best life.
No, I know.
How do you define what is your best life, or what do you think we should be?
Well, mental health is an enabler that allows, in my perspective, it's an enabler that allows us to make the most of the opportunities we have as human beings, right? In a very basic sense. Like, I think we're all very used to seeing physical capability or incapability. I think what we are pretty bad as a society is recognizing mental capability or mental incapability. The things that hold us back, the things that allow us to do these things. I feel so privileged to be here today, but I recognize that's because of, you know, a lot of luck that I have and a lot of situation I have myself. So for me, it's about trying to get that balance and opportunity that I'm able to get. So I think on a personal level, it's very much about living my best life. But I see mental health as very much the avenue by which you're able to do that. If that's potentially a slightly longer way of answering it.
Perfect. Michael Washington, thank you very much for joining us on the podcast.
Pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.
So now we're joined on the podcast by a friend of Mentl, big supporter, judge last year of the Mentl Awards 2023, and I'm delighted to say she's agreed to be a judge again this year for us, Dr. Nahida Nayez Ahmed, who is now the Chief Medical Officer of Sakina. Nahida, thank you for joining us again on the
Thank
podcast.
you for having
So
me.
we're here in the Kingdom. We're here at the Sync Summit. What brought you here? Because I know you're passionate about the conversation about digital well-being. But what did you come to hear, see, say?
So with the launch of Sakina, we are expanding the mental health interventions, mental health, everything that can be done under mental health. And of course, digital well-being is a huge especially given the surge of, digital addiction, the social media, cyberbullying is huge. So that was what attracted us. And obviously, ITRA and Sync Summit has friends who were gracious enough to invite us. I've been chosen and nominated to be part of the Global Wellbeing Summit committee member, so that's a privilege and an honor. Thank you. And again, the wealth of knowledge here, it's amazing. It's super, just having those conversations from people around the world and what's being done in this realm of digital well-being. It's been a great learning experience and a wonderful enrichment. ITRA stands for enrichment, so it's truly enriching to be here.
You mentioned Sakina.
Yeah.
Relatively new announcement. In fact, it was just last week, wasn't it?
Just last week.
So please tell our audience about Sakina and what the mission is at Sakina now.
So Sakina is basically a dream to have mental health available for everybody and mental health being acceptable by everybody. So that's what we are set out on doing. And we have aligned ourselves completely with the Department of Health's mental health model of care, which you probably have heard me talk a million times before, which is a lot about prevention, high quality intervention and rehabilitation. This is our basic three-pronged approach.
Yeah.
And we want to make sure people can access mental health from the, where it's closest to them. Mental health becomes a part of a holistic team, be it medical problems, surgical problems, trauma, oncology, whatnot. So we want to address mental health in every aspect of healthcare.
Because it's there in every aspect.
It's there,
of
exactly.
healthcare.
But it was not addressed so far.
Yeah.
It has always been siloed. It has always been backburnered. And until a person is completely devastated or disabled by mental health challenges, they never sought help. So what we're trying to do is change that paradigm.
You're trying to bring the conversation
Absolutely.
to preventative rather than reactive.
Exactly. Yeah.
Great.
It's all about well-being and wellness. Promote that. Yeah.
What have you heard here at the conference that has sparked anything within you? Go, right, that is a conversation that's important.
The whole platform for digital well-being, it's such an uncharted territory. I mean, there's so many precarious elements to it. Do you want to go?
Yeah, we'll do that again.
Okay.
So, here at the conference, what have you heard, seen, listened to that sparked thoughts, conversations, reactions within yourself?
I was really inspired by this morning's opening talk, especially with the woman who lost a child to cyberbullying. That as a parent, that really hits hard home. So while we are venturing into talking about well-being for digital space and what needs to be done, we also need to understand the mental health and mental challenges overlap that come with people who are prone to digital addiction.
Yeah.
There are people on the spectrum who tend to, side with just being isolated on the digital space. People with social anxiety, people who are vulnerable to bullying and vulnerable to any kind of mental health challenges are, on this platform. So I think from me, takeaway point would be just to look in more and see that where we can provide those interventions, where we can plug in those interventions to make sure that these individuals don't suffer.
It's interesting because, we've got the adoption of AI now. We've got technology accelerating in such a pace. Is this one of the biggest challenges we're going to face moving forward? Because it's not going anywhere, is it? We're not going to be able to put this technology back in a box. So for our children's sake, we really all need to kind of lean into what digital well-being means.
Yeah. So again, I mean, like what Anas said this morning, the host of the opening, you've given a dagger, you can cut the vegetables or you can stab someone. So you have to come up with the ways to make the best out of it. Yeah. And I'm sure AI is very promising. For a lot of us, the access to care becomes easier. The access to knowledge and education and awareness becomes easier with AI. And so I think with good regulations, good oversight, AI is a promise.
Brilliant. That feels like a mic drop moment. Dr. Nahida, thank you again for joining us on the Mental Space Podcast. And we'll see you soon for the awards.
Will do. Take care.
So we're joined now on the podcast by Ollie Barrett, who is the Chief Network Officer with Connector, I believe. But for the Sync Summit, you are the main man on stage. one of the co-MCs and presenters.
That's right. So I'm one of the co-hosts. So I should be on roller skates really, Scott, because I'm between the main stage and our spotlight sessions.
Oh, we're on it. We've tied you down in the middle of the lunch break as well. So
good to see you.
Right. On the Mental Space podcast, we always ask our first question, which is, what does mental health mean to you?
Well, the short answer, it means a huge amount. I don't have a snappy definition, but for me, it relates to how healthy my thoughts are, my feelings are. It's inextricably linked to my physical health, but really for me, its importance becomes greater with every passing day, because the clearer I'm able to think, the better I am able to support those I love. And frankly, I wish I'd taken my own mental health more seriously earlier on in my life, and I wish we'd been talking more clearly about our own mental health many years earlier.
Well, that's what mentl is all about, trying to have these open and honest conversations about mental health. It's interesting because it's great because we often talk about the fact that we are the foundation of all of our responsibilities. So all those wives, partners, children's, businesses, employees, all depend on you being on top of your game and looking after yourself.
Yeah, and vice versa. Their ability to read us, to understand us, to support us, that's the team effort. So very often that phrase, how are you, has become a sort of proxy for hello.
Yeah.
And if only we asked that question twice,
You're
delve
absolutely
deeper.
correct. You're on stage, you have a ring side seat for all these incredible conversations that are happening.
Yeah.
What are you seeing, hearing, that's making you feel and think differently?
So it's the first day. Our theme overall is digital well-being, and I think what's powerful to me is just this summit's ability to grasp this idea of a paradox, to say there might be contradictions. It's that idea, Walt Whitman said, didn't he? We contain multitudes. That idea, things aren't as simple as they first appear. So if you say, we've got a session again this afternoon on this, is creativity enhanced by tech or hindered by tech? To me, increasingly now, that's like saying, is food enhanced by fire? You know, because you're thinking about cooking and you're thinking about burning.
Yeah.
And the truth is complicated. So I think having space to talk about that, you've got Steve Wozniak, the co-founder of Apple, saying the big tech companies have got some big questions to answer. Laws need to change.
Fascinating to hear him saying he almost regrets his part in the technological revolution that has been like the late 90s and early 2000s.
Yeah, and not afraid to hold some of these big companies to account. Some amazing campaigners talking about, frankly, so some of the harms being perpetrated by social media.
Yeah.
Again, you've got educators in this space talking about some of the opportunities it unlocks, and neither of them are necessarily wrong. And it's that ability to see those two cases side by side.
Fascinating, because Anas Bakash, who was moderating that first session with Steve and Kirsten, he was talking about it being a tool.
Yeah.
It being a knife. Either you chop the vegetables or you can stab someone with it.
Yeah.
What's your perspective of that?
Well, I think that's the way to see it. That doesn't that doesn't mean that you let organisations off the hook when it comes to where those things could go.
You don't necessarily have to sharpen a knife and put it in people's hands and tell them to use it.
Well, and it's
that's
that
what Steve was saying.
And it's that deeper idea of responsibility, isn't it? Just not only observing what's happening and hearing those stories, and Kristen Bride, forgive me, who tragically lost her son to suicide, has seen that firsthand. He was a victim of cyberbullying. To hear those stories firsthand, to be reminded that they exist, to give them space to be explored by the tech companies themselves, right? Yeah. Really, really important.
What's exciting you about the conversation? I mean, when they said, will you come over and MC this little event for us? Nothing's ever little in the kingdom. What excited you about it?
The clarity of mind to say, let's have a gathering on a huge topic, and to hold that paradox in mind, to say it isn't going to be some cheerleading, flag-waving jamboree. Yeah. And on the other hand, it's not going to be some doom-saying, sort of safety-driven, sort of doom fest, if you like. So to embrace both. Yeah. I think the range of speakers, so from health to education to AI, really intriguing. And then, of course, the chance to meet people from all over the world and get their different perspectives.
Ollie, I know you're a busy man, so we'll let you go, but thank you for joining us on the Mental Space Podcast.
Thank you, Scott. Very good to see you. Cheers.
So we're joined now on the Mental Space Podcast by Amy Blankson, the Chief Evangelist at the Digital Wellness Institute. Remember, we met Nina earlier. So Amy works with, and you founded the Digital Wellness Institute. So tell me why you founded it in the first place.
Oh, we founded the Digital Wellness Institute back in 2018, and we did so because at the time Apple had just come out with screen time.
Yeah.
And when they did so, they actually disbanded about 10 organizations that we knew that were doing great work in the digital well-being space that were maybe seen as competitors.
Right.
So we gathered a change.org petition of about 2,000 signatures in under a week, sent it off to Apple, and Apple actually reinstated the organizations, which was phenomenal.
Okay.
And that actually was such an empowering moment for us because we realized there's 2,000 people right in our neighborhood who care about this issue. I thought I was the only one. And come to find out, there were people all over the globe who are passionate about this topic and just needed someone to help organize them. So we did.
So from 2,000 people to being keynote speaker on the stage here at Sync, why did you come and what did you want to say?
So I came to Sync because I think being part of a global dialogue about this issue is absolutely critical. It is essential that this conversation is not European or American or Canadian, but truly global. And there's a lot of different perspectives to accomplish that. So I wanted to come with the message that, A, there's a lot of great work being done in this space.
Yeah.
We don't want to recreate the wheel. It's important to share what we're doing, what we've done, and what we're hoping to accomplish so that we can begin to create more collaborations.
Okay, so I'm going to drill into that. What have you done? What are you doing? And what do you want to accomplish?
So what we have done is that we created a framework called the Digital Flourishing Framework. And the framework was designed to help individuals to be able to self-assess whether or not they were digitally well.
Yeah.
So if I were to ask you, Scott, are you digitally well? You may or may not have any idea for whether you are or not. We know this for physical health and mental health. We have frameworks. But digital wellness is so new that we don't yet know how to wrap our minds around it.
Okay.
And so what we do is we have a quick survey that's free. You can take it on the digitalwellnessinstitute.com.
Yep.
And it helps you to assess where you are at as of today. It's like a pulse survey.
Yeah.
And you can identify certain domains of your life that you might need to lean in a bit more to help understand. That's what we've done.
Okay.
What we're doing now is actually taking that framework into businesses because we feel that there's a lot of mental health resources for young people, but very little actually for those of us in the workplace. And let's be honest, we all need help too.
Absolutely.
So we're helping to create frameworks for companies and particularly leaders to be able to understand how they can help their employees through policies, training, resources, their own leadership to really begin to move the needle on what being a digitally well employee looks like.
Okay, so because at Mentl, obviously one of the things we try to do is tackle the stigma of mental health, and we go into organizations to try and teach them the ROI of helping their people thrive. They're interlinked, one follows the other, but your opinion between mental health and digital wellness and how those two gel?
Yes, so one of the things I'm passionate about is that since COVID started, 2020 to now, our screen time has gone up 30%. And over the period of time, we all thought our screen time would go back down when work went back to normal, but it hasn't. And what we've discovered is that no organizations are really measuring the impact of the screen time on employee mental health. We know there's a burnout epidemic, we know there's an engagement problem, and that there's a great resignation, and we keep trying to throw programming at these issues when actually it's a human sustainability issue. It's an energy level, it's what we're asking of employees, and the speed and the impact of the technology on our lives is something that I think we actually need to quantify, and we need policies to help support those employees to be able to thrive.
Because that whole idea of work-life balance doesn't really exist anymore. When we're at home, we're still on the second or third device, often with incoming from work on a night time with the WhatsApp and all that sort of thing.
You got it.
What are some of your solutions then? What are some of the things you go, I'm not going to, don't give me your entire solution. Well, actually, no, do give me your entire solution and then I can steal it. But no, what are maybe the top 3 things that you feel that organizations should be focused on when helping their employees disconnect?
Well, I've had some practice at distilling this information. So the 3 things that we have limited down what digital balance is for an employer is digital boundaries, digital digital belonging and digital balance, meaning the screen time balance that you have at work.
Yeah.
And that by really incentivizing organizations through both positive incentives and also through policies, that we can then begin to help employees to have the support they need to be able to speak out, even if it's their boss who's causing, some of the disgruntlement.
I feel that fits in the boundaries section.
Yes.
Is that where we're talking about whether it be no WhatsApp groups after 6 o'clock or no emails on a weekend, or does it go further than that?
So that would be the boundaries.
Yeah.
The screen balance is when you're at work, how often are you sitting in front of a screen? How often are you aware? Do you get up to take breaks?
Yeah.
And digital belonging comes back to the idea of inclusion, but it's also about those individuals who are in hybrid working places who might not be in a physical space, but still need to be included to feel engaged in the organization.
I could talk to you all day. I'm going to distill this down into the last couple of questions. We were talking to Nina earlier, and we were talking about fear versus flourishing. A lot of fear floating around. We have seen how the social media age, the unintended consequences of that technology, and how that's not been good for Gen Z and their anxiety problems. We've got Gen A coming after, and I guess we've got Gen AI, which is a term that we've heard a lot about there. How do we ensure that the next generations don't suffer from the same sort of anxieties that Gen Z, and I always have a lot of empathy for Gen Z, because they were kind of born up, into this world of digital information, and as parents, didn't really know that was harmful. Like, it took us as grown-ups 10 years to go, oh yeah, maybe, to start with, it was all, this is amazing. And then all of a sudden we're going, actually this isn't so good. So what is the hope for the next generation, but also what do we need to do to make sure that they don't go down the same path as Gen Z?
Well, I think the hope is the easy part. My hope is that we'll have a generation that is more mindful of these issues and very self-aware to be able to self-regulate. The how is much harder. And I think that sometimes what happens is we treat mental health as though it is the same for all generations and all approaches.
Yeah.
And I actually think that if you think about the different generations as striations, like in a geological format, if you see the different levels of sediment, the same thing's happening.
You make me feel like a fossil now, but that's not...
We're all fossils, right?
Well, technically, yes, that's correct.
So,
well, we'll be at one point.
But I think for my daughter, who's 17, she
Yeah.
was born 2 months before the iPhone came out.
Okay.
The challenges that she faced, both when the iPhone came out in her life and with the period of time during COVID, are very different than, say, my mother or myself.
Yeah.
And so I think really addressing the unique challenges for mental health requires pinpointing what were those pressure points that formed who they are, and how do we talk about anxiety in a way that resonates with them and provide solutions that are unique to their generation.
Last question, and it's a question we always ask on Mental Space. We threw it at Nina earlier. What does mental health mean to you?
Mental health really comes down to healthy self-awareness. I think that everybody can benefit from introspection and really being self-aware. I will be quite transparent with you that I'm somebody who struggles with anxiety myself. I have for years, unrelated to technology. But I think the more tools that I've learned over the years about anxiety, self-management, are the very things that help me to thrive today.
Yeah.
And my hope for the future generations is that as we talk about mental health, it's a really a healthy practice. It's not a stigma. It's something that is a sign of flourishing.
Amy, thank you for joining us on the Mental Space podcast.
Yeah, thank you.